Hi, this is Pastor Larry here, and in this video, I want to talk about metrics, and in particular, why we need to stop measuring the wrong things. We find ourselves at kind of an intersection of disruption where we have the pre-COVID world, we have the post-COVID world, and kind of a new normal, but we still got the old. And at a time like this, it's very important that we have measurements and metrics that are helpful, not that we're helpful and no longer tell us what we need to know. So in this video, I want to talk about flash reports and why every leader needs one. I want to talk about the inherent problem with every metric and every number we ever use. I want to talk about why some of our old ones that were so dependable and so trusted no longer are of much value, and how we need to look at some of the new metrics as we move into the new normal. So let's just start out by talking about flash reports. Every leader needs a flash report or a series of flash reports. What are they? A flash report is kind of a summary of information, and it tells me 80% of what I need to know. Not everything, but about 80%. And based on that, a leader can make quick and wise decisions. Let me give you an example. If I owned a restaurant, what I would want to know is gross sales between 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. every single night. And over a period of time, I would be able to figure out whether things were going well, and I'd have an early warning sign if they weren't. I wouldn't care whether they were high margin dishes or low margin dishes. If something changed significantly, then I would step back and I would take a deep dive to find out why. So it becomes that early warning system towards problems and towards opportunities. Now, what's the inherent problem with every single metrics we will ever use? And that is they use numbers. And the problem with numbers is this: they lie. You see, nothing is meaningful without a context, and that includes a number. And so if I don't know the story behind the number, I can't really know what that number means. For instance, a number of years ago, I had a pastor friend call me. It was, maybe April or May. And he said, Larry, I need some help. We're $100,000 behind in our budget. And I said, what's the problem? He said, we're $100,000 behind in our budget. I said, well, why? What's the problem? And then he got it. You see, if he had somebody who every February gave him $200,000, then he ought to be throwing a party. He's $100,000 above where he should expect to be. If he's had a bunch of people move, that calls for a different response. If he has a whole series of people who have pulled back their giving, that calls for even a different response. So you see, you've got to get the context. A very recent one was the decline in viewership for most churches after Easter. I had a bunch of pastors calling me and texting me and saying, Larry, I'm not so sure the internet works anymore. For a while, we went like this, and since Easter, every single week it's gone down. Well, in context, I said, well, that's happened forever since Easter. Things tend to go down. So again, you want a flash report, but in that flash report, you need to know the context. And we always need to understand that numbers lie, and numbers are just the pathway for us to get to the story behind the number. Now, what are some of the metrics that don't work anymore? And I'm going to combine, as we talk about those, that don't work anymore, maybe some of the adjustments that you might want to make as we move into the future. So let's just talk about a few of them. One of them is attendance. The old Outreach 100 model of year-over-year growth, frankly, is completely broken as we go into the future. Now, I'm not one of those who was opposed to the Outreach 100, fastest growing list and largest list. I found it very helpful because it helped me to know what was possible, what God was doing in situations outside of my own. For me, it was kind of like, let's say if you're a track buff and know anything about its history, the 4-minute mile. There was a period of time where people thought it was impossible for a human being to run a mile in less than 4 minutes. But once it was done and then well known and publicized, suddenly in the next 2 years, all kinds of people ran sub 4-minute miles because they suddenly realized it was possible. So I happen to have liked that metrics, but frankly, it's not going to be helpful anymore. Now, why? First of all, as we gather together and start meeting again over a period of time, there's going to be social distancing, there's going to be restrictions, there's going to be more fear by people of whether or not they should come. There might be some older people who used to come every time. Sometimes we would have ministries of a nursing home or whatever. You'd bring them to church. That's the last thing you're going to do in the future. So that is going to slow the numbers down. Then on top of that, Most of us have really upped our game when it comes to our services online. And that means that going forward, some people who used to come when the kids were having a really rough morning or they weren't quite feeling perfectly, they're much more likely going forward to stay home and watch online because we're providing them with a quality experience. So as we think about attendance going forward, asking how many people simply come to our facility is no longer a good number for us to be able to use. We're going to have to figure something along the lines of engagement. You see, before this, I think most churches were more like Macy's, and now most churches are trying to be more like Target or more like Walmart, if you will. Maybe I'll do a video on the difference in the future of those two. But just very briefly, Macy's is a bricks and mortar store with a website. Well, that's what Target and Walmart used to be, and Amazon was eating their lunch. And they began to realize they need to put a lot of energy and focus into the internet, not just foot traffic at their stores. And they would see themselves now as a company that wants to measure sales much more than a company that wants to measure foot traffic. Now, I don't know what all these new metrics are going to be. I'm trying to raise the questions so that you and I can figure out over time what are meaningful numbers, especially in light of the story behind them. But we're not going to be successful if we go forward as Macy's just counting foot traffic. We're going to have to figure out engagement, and that is a very, very different number. Now, another thing we're going to have to figure out and look at differently is finances. You know, in most churches, there's a executive pastor or business administrator, and they kind of figure out per capita giving. It's been a helpful number for a long period of time. You take your average attendance, you take your giving, you do the division, and you say, okay, for everybody that comes, this is generally how much money will come in. And it makes it easy to make decisions on how big of a facility you should have, whether you should add parking here, and all kinds of different decisions. But as we have upped our game in the internet, what we are finding is people who give are not just anymore people that live within 20 minutes of the campus, but a lot of people from a far away distance have begun to contribute, which, by the way, when it comes to attendance numbers and engagement numbers, tells us, okay, if you're writing a check, especially consistently, you are pretty committed and pretty connected here. So we're going to have to pay much more attention to where our donors are giving from. For instance, I recommend to all of my coaching clients that one of the things they do is they take every first-time donor and they take a look at the zip code. And most of them are finding out that there's a good number of new donors that are not within that 20-minute drive time of a campus, or if they're multi-site, their campuses. And that becomes a new way to look at finances. So that's going to be a major part of it. Where is it coming from? How consistent is it? Is it a one-off because I listen quite a bit and I'll write a check? Or is it something that continues on? Another area in finance we'll have to look differently at has to do with percentages. All the time I get asked this, well, what percent should be spent on budget? What percent should be spent on debt? What percent should be spent on staff? I've never in the past been asked what percent should be spent on online. But going forward, that's going to be a significant number. If we're going to be a Macy's with a website, get some junior hire to do your website. But if you're going to be Target or you're going to be Walmart and you're going to significantly minister to these folks, then we're going to have to find a way to measure that differently. And we're going to have to find a way to have more budget for both people and technology in that area if we want to do well. Another one we need to measure differently probably is our online campuses. You see, in the past, most people just tended to measure eyeballs. And they say, hey, we have X amount of viewers. But now, if it's going to be a significant ministry, we need to know how many unique devices. We need to know where those zip codes are of the people that are watching. So we can figure out, is there just a few people over here and we are a secondary source of in their spiritual growth? Or there's a group of people over here that maybe can gather together and we can create community. And instead of being a secondary source, become a primary source and make sure they are truly and genuinely being discipled. On Facebook, we need to measure likes. On YouTube, we need to measure subscriptions. And we need to move away from what I think we had in the past, which was just counting eyeballs, which was more of a sales model, to what I would call a subscription model, much as most internet companies have done. You see, we need to not just be measuring, oh, they watched it once and a whole bunch of people. What really is important is how many people keep watching over time. And that leads to another measurement we need to focus on going forward. And frankly, one we didn't focus on enough in most churches in the past, and it's retention. Retention is the best measurement of organizational health. Not necessarily spiritual health, but organizational health. For instance, if you have a children's pastor and every single slot in the children's department is filled every single year, but it's filled by different people, you do not have a great children's pastor. You have a problem on your hands. And it's just like churches that counted just attendance but didn't know what the retention of people was. And they would be quite excited even though they were a revolving door, but they had no idea because they weren't measuring retention. So if they had 200 new people come and 100 left, they celebrated we grew by 100, but in reality, they had a problem on their hands. I encourage you to measure retention everywhere you can, because it's the earliest warning sign of buy-in, of engagement, and the opportunity to disciple, and the earliest warning sign that what you're doing is you're selling gym memberships, but nobody's showing up actually more than 1 or 2 times at the gym. And the early warning sign that you are playing church, but you are not really making disciples. Now, these are just a few examples of the metrics that we're going to have to look at. I could go on and on, I won't. But what I wanted to do was stir the pot for you and give you some things to think about as you gather together with your team and your top leaders. Maybe watch this video together and then go to a whiteboard and ask the question, what are the metrics we've trusted in before? In what ways might they not be so helpful going forward? And are there some new things we need to start looking at and measuring so we know we're actually hitting the target that we're aiming at and we're actually moving forward rather than being deceived by numbers that lie to us? You know, this crisis that we've gone through, like all crisis, brings great opportunity. And as we figure out the right way to measure things into the future, we're going to know whether we're seizing that opportunity or missing that opportunity. I hope this has been helpful. If you want to get the next thing that I drop online, go ahead and subscribe and you'll be the first to know. Until then, keep after it. God bless and stay strong.